The metal sits in a glass case between a busted electric guitar and a tray of wedding rings nobody came back for, and the man behind the counter does not know what it is. Snow falls slow and gray past the front window of the pawn shop, the kind of late January snow that does not melt so much as wait. The Purple Heart lies face up under the fluorescent light, the gold profile of George Washington tarnished at the edges, the purple enamels scratched near the bottom where someone had pried at it with something dull. A small white sticker on the felt reads, $18, $18, for a thing a man bled to earn. Caleb Brand stood at that counter with his hands flat on the cold glass and felt something turn over, slow in his chest, something he had spent 4 years training himself not to feel. He had come in for a wrench set. He left thinking about a stranger he had never met, a name he did not yet know, and a question he could not put back down once he had picked it up. Beside his boot, a German shepherd lifted her head and watched the metal, the way she watched everything that mattered, still and certain, ears forward, dark eyes fixed. Her name was Juno. She had not made a sound since they walked in, but now she leaned the smallest fraction toward the case, and Caleb had learned a long time ago that when Juno leaned toward a thing, it was worth turning to look. If a story about a forgotten medal and the man who would not let it stay forgotten is the kind of story that stays with you, take a moment to subscribe and stay until the end. This one earns its ending. Now let me take you back to the morning it started, and the cold little town where a stranger's pain was sitting in a glass case for the price of a sandwich. The town was called Harlan Fork, tucked into the eastern shoulder of the mountains where the highway narrowed to 2 lanes and the gas stations still wrote their prices on plastic signs by hand. Caleb had landed there the way he landed everywhere since he left the Corps, which was to say, without intending to. A truck with a bad alternator, a motel with a working heater, a diner that served coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. He had told himself 3 days. He was on day 9. He was 41 years old, built lean and hard, the way a man stays when he has spent 2 decades refusing to sit still, with a weathered face and a short crop of dark hair gone gray at the temples. There was a thin, pale scar along the left side of his jaw, the kind that no longer hurt but never fully went away, and he had the eyes of someone who never truly stopped scanning rooms, roads, exits, and people. He did not smile easily. He did not talk much. He had buried more men than he could comfortably count, and somewhere in the years between the last deployment and this snowbound town, he had stopped expecting to be surprised by anything. The medal surprised him. The man behind the counter was named Dell, a heavy, tired man in his 60s, with reading glasses pushed up into thinning hair and a flannel shirt missing its top button. He had been running the pawn shop in Harlan Fork for 19 years, and he ran it the way a man runs a thing he inherited rather than chose. When Caleb tapped the glass over the metal, Dell barely looked up from his crossword. "That old thing," Dell said, "came in a couple months back, box lot from an estate sale up the valley. Whole drawer of junk that was in the bottom of it." "It's a Purple Heart," Caleb said. Dell shrugged. "Folks bring in all kinds of metals. Don't move fast. People want tools, guns, gold. Nobody's buying somebody else's war." Caleb did not answer right away. Juno had settled onto her haunches beside him, large and muscular, easily 80 pounds, with a classic tan and black saddle coat and a black mask across her muzzle. Her ears stood tall and fully erect, and there was a small notch in the left one, an old tear from a day Caleb did not like to think about. She wore a plain, worn leather collar. No vest, nothing official anymore. She watched Dell with the flat patience of a working dog who had decided to wait and see. $18, Caleb said. Make it 15. You're taking it today. Caleb reached into his coat and laid a 20 on the glass. He did not wait for change. He picked up the metal, and it was lighter than he remembered metals being, which was a strange thought, because he had one of his own in a drawer in a storage unit 2 states away, and he had not looked at it in years. He turned it over. On the back, engraved in small block letters, worn soft by handling, was a name, Raymond T. Aldrich. He stood there a moment longer than he meant to. Then he asked Dell if the estate sale had a name, a town, anything, and Dell, who wanted the conversation over, said it had come from a place called Sutter's Bend, maybe 40 minutes north, and that the woman who ran the estate sales was named Patrice, and she could be found most days at the antique barn off Route 9. Caleb thanked him. He folded the metal into his palm, the way he would have carried something fragile and alive, and he walked out into the snow with Juno close at his heel. He told himself he would just find out where it was supposed to go. He told himself it was a small thing, a half-day's drive, a name returned to a family. He did not yet understand that the name on the back of that metal belonged to a man whose own people had let it slip away, and that finding out why would take him into the quietest kind of heartbreak there is. That night he sat in the motel with the medal on the nightstand and his laptop open on the bed, and he searched the name, Raymond T. Aldrich. There was not much. An obituary, brief and recent, from a county paper. Raymond Aldrich, 83, of Sutter's Bend, passed away in November after a long illness. United States Army, served in Vietnam, preceded in death by his wife Eleanor, survived by a daughter. The daughter's name was not given. There was no mention of the medal. There was no mention of how a man's Purple Heart ends up in the bottom of a box lot, sold off by strangers, priced at $18 in a town he never lived in. Juno lay across the foot of the bed with her chin on her paws, and every so often she opened her eyes and looked at the medal on the nightstand, and then at Caleb, and then closed them again. He did not sleep much. He kept thinking about the word survived. A man survives a war, comes home, gets old, and then a single line in a newspaper says he was survived by a daughter, and somehow the thing he bled for ends up in a glass case for sale. Something in that arithmetic did not add up, and Caleb had spent his whole life unable to leave a thing alone once it did not add up. In the morning, the sky had gone the color of an old nickel, and the snow had stopped, leaving the streets of Harlan Fork crusted and silent. Caleb drove north with Juno in the passenger seat, her breath fogging the cold glass, the metal in his coat pocket where he could feel the small weight of it against his ribs. Sutter's Bend turned out to be smaller than Harlan Fork, a cluster of buildings along a creek that had iced over at the edges, a feed store, a church with a white steeple, a diner with a hand-lettered sign. He found the antique barn off Route 9, a long, low building with a tin roof and a gravel lot half full of trucks. Patrice was a small, sharp woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned back and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she remembered the Aldrich estate the moment he said the name. She remembered it because it had been sad, she said, the way some of them were. An old man's whole life packed into a county auction because there was nobody to take it. She had run the sale herself in early December, in the cold, and the daughter had not been there. The daughter had not been there at all, Patrice said, and there had been something in her voice when she said it that made Caleb slow down and listen. "You knew the family?" he asked. "Knew Raymond?" Patrice said. Everybody around here did. He fixed clocks. Whole back room of his house was clocks, all of them keeping the same time. He could take apart a thing the size of your thumbnail and put it back so it ran another 100 years. She pulled off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. He got sick the last couple years, real sick. And there was a man who came around, called himself a care coordinator, said he was helping Raymond manage things. Helping him manage right out of everything he owned, you ask me. Nobody asked me, though. Juno had walked the length of the barn and come back to sit at Caleb's side, pressed lightly against his leg. Patrice looked down at her, and her face softened the way hard faces sometimes do around a good dog. "What was the man's name?" Caleb asked. "Garrett Voss," Patrice said. "Real smooth, wore a nice coat, came up from the city, set up something called Meridian Senior Solutions, had an office over the bank for about a year. Helped a lot of old folks around here manage their affairs." She put her glasses back on. "Half of them are in worse shape now than before. He helped them. The other half are dead, and their houses got sold to pay off bills nobody can quite explain. Raymond was one of those. By the time he passed, there wasn't anything left but a box of clocks and a drawer of junk, and the county sold that to cover what he supposedly owed." Caleb stood very still. Beside him, Juno had gone still too, the particular stillness she fell into when the air in a room changed. He took the medal out of his pocket and showed it to Patrice, and she looked at it for a long moment and then looked away. And when she spoke again, her voice was rougher. "That should have gone to Dana," she said, "his daughter. Stay with the story, because here is where it stops being about a medal and starts being about a man who learned to take everything from people who had no one left to stop him. Garrett Voss did not steal with a gun. He stole with a smile and a clipboard and a stack of forms nobody could read, and he was very good at it, and he had never once been made to answer for any of it. That was about to change, though neither Caleb nor anyone in Sutter's Bend knew it yet. The daughter, Dana, lived 2 hours away in a city Caleb had passed through but never stopped in. Patrice had an address from the estate paperwork, and after some hesitation, she wrote it on the back of a sales receipt and pressed it into his hand. "She didn't abandon him," Patrice said, "whatever it looks like. I knew that girl when she was small. Something kept her away. I never knew what." Caleb thanked her and folded the receipt into the same pocket as the medal. He drove south through the long gray afternoon, the mountains falling away behind him, and he thought about the man with the clocks. A man who could take apart a thing the size of a thumbnail and make it run another 100 years. A man who had come home from one war and built a quiet life of keeping time for other people, and who had ended it alone, his life packed into a county auction, his medal in a box of junk. Caleb had known men like that. He had served beside men like that and watched them come home to find the country they fought for had no particular place for them. It made him tired, in a way that combat never had. Watching somebody quietly lose everything over years felt worse, somehow, than any single bad day downrange. Dana Aldrich lived in a narrow rented house on a street of narrow rented houses, with a porch that needed paint and a wind chime made of old spoons that turned in the cold. Caleb sat in his truck a long moment before he went up. Juno watched him, then watched the house, then looked back at him with the steady attention that always seemed to ask him a question he could not quite hear. He clipped her leash on, more for the neighbors than for her, and they went up the cracked walk together. The woman who answered the door was in her early 50s, thin and tired, with gray threading through dark hair pulled back from a face that had once been pretty and was now mostly worn. She looked at Caleb, a stranger in a canvas coat, and then she looked down at the dog, and Juno did the thing she rarely did for people she had just met. She sat. She sat and looked up at Dana Aldrich, with her ears soft and her whole body easy, and Caleb felt the small surprise of it, because Juno did not give that to many. "My name is Caleb Brand," he said. "I was a Marine. I think I have something that belonged to your father." Dana's hand tightened on the edge of the door. For a moment he thought she might close it. Then her eyes went to his coat pocket as if she already knew, and her mouth pressed flat, and she stepped back to let them in. The house was small and clean and almost bare, the way a house gets when someone has been selling things to make rent. There was a couch, a lamp, a kitchen table with 2 chairs. On the wall hung one framed photograph, an old man in a brown jacket standing in front of a wall of clocks, squinting at the camera. Not quite smiling. Caleb did not have to ask. He took the medal from his pocket and set it on the kitchen table between them, and Dana Aldrich looked at it and put her hand over her mouth, and did not move for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice came out small. "Where did you find it?" "A pawn shop," Caleb said. 2 towns over in a glass case they didn't know what it was. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. $18, she said, and Caleb felt the back of his neck go cold because he had not told her the price. That's what they told me, too. When I called around after he died trying to find his things, $18. That's what a man's whole life is worth, apparently, by the time Garrett Voss is done with it. Juno had crossed the small room and lain down at Dana's feet, and Dana's hand had dropped without her seeming to notice, and was resting on the dog's broad head. Caleb pulled out one of the 2 chairs and sat slowly, the way you sit when you do not want to spook a thing, and he asked her to tell him what happened. And after a long silence, she did. She had not abandoned her father. That was the first thing she needed him to understand, and she said it with a fierceness that told him how many times she had said it to herself in the dark. She had been sick. 3 years back, she had gotten sick. The kind of sick that eats your savings and your strength and your ability to drive 2 hours into the mountains. And by the time she was on her feet again, a man named Garrett Voss had moved into the space her absence left. He had been so helpful. That was the word she kept using, helpful, like it was something filthy. He had power of attorney, before she understood what that meant. He was paying her father's bills, managing his care, handling the paperwork that had piled up while Raymond's mind softened and his hands, those clever clock-fixing hands, began to shake too badly to work. By the time Dana was well enough to fight, the fight was already lost on paper. Voss had documents. He had signatures, her father's signature, shaky but real, on forms that signed away the house, the savings, everything, in exchange for a level of care that never actually came. He had moved Raymond into a facility, 2 towns over, and then a cheaper one, and then a cheaper one, and each move came with new fees, new liens, new explanations that did not quite explain. When Dana demanded an accounting, Voss was always gracious, always sorry, always armed with another form. And then her father died, and the county sold what was left to cover debts that Voss's own paperwork had created, and the metal went into a box, and the box went into an auction, and that was the end of it. Except it was not the end of it, because Caleb had walked into a pawn shop looking for a wrench set, and walked out unable to leave it alone. He has a whole list of them, Dana said. I tried to get the county to look at it. I tried a lawyer. He wanted a retainer I didn't have. Everybody said the same thing. The paperwork's clean. Your father signed. There's nothing here. She looked at Caleb across the table, and her eyes were dry now, dry and exhausted. I'm telling you, so you'll understand, not because I think anything can be done. There's nothing here. That's what everyone says. Caleb looked at the medal on the table, and then at the photograph on the wall, the old man in front of his clocks. He thought about the word clean. Paperwork that is clean is paperwork that has been made clean, and a thing that has been made clean by one set of hands can be taken apart by another. Raymond Aldridge had known that. A man who could disassemble a mechanism the size of a thumbnail and find the one worn gear knew that any machine, however smooth, had a part that wore Voss's machine had run a long time. That did not mean it had no worn part. It meant nobody had looked closely enough to find it. You said other families, Caleb said. How many? Dana was quiet a moment. I know of 4. There are probably more. Do they know each other? Everybody thinks they're the only one. Everybody thinks it's their own fault for not being there. She said the last part very low, and Juno pressed closer against her leg. And Dana's hand moved in the dog's fur without her seeming to know it. Caleb stood. He picked up the medal and held it out to her, and she took it. And for a moment they both held it, the cold weight of it between their fingers. This is yours, he said. It was always yours. Then he said the other thing he had not planned to say, the thing that came up out of him the way water comes up through ice when the ground beneath it shifts. I'd like to find the others, the other families. I'd like to put them in a room together and see what a man's clean paperwork looks like when 4 families lay it side by side. Dana stared at him. Why? She said. You don't know us. You don't know him. Why would you do that? Caleb looked down at Juno, who looked back up at him, and then he looked at the photograph on the wall one more time. Because somebody priced him at $18, he said, and somebody has to be the one who says that's wrong. He did not sleep at all that night. He sat in the truck outside a motel on the edge of the city with Juno's head on his knee and a county map open on the dash, and he started to make a list. Not of evidence, not yet. A list of people. That was always where it started. Not with the enemy, with the people the enemy had counted on staying alone. The first family he found was a brother and sister named Foley, whose mother had been one of Voss's clients before she died, in a care facility, 40 miles from the home she had lived in for 60 years. The second was a man named Okafor, whose father, a retired schoolteacher, had signed away a paid-off house in exchange for care that turned out to be a shared room and a television that did not work. The third was a widow named June Castellano, sharp as a tack at 76, who had nearly become a victim herself before her granddaughter pulled her out, and who had spent 2 years since then keeping a folder. June Castellano had a folder, and when Caleb sat at her kitchen table and she set that folder down in front of him, thick and ordered and tabbed, he understood that he had found the worn gear. I knew what he was, June said. She was a small woman, sharp-eyed, with white hair set in a careful wave and hands that did not shake. My husband was an accountant for 40 years. You don't sit across the dinner table from a man like that for 40 years without learning to read a balance sheet. When Voss came around after Harold passed, all sympathy and forms, I smiled and I signed nothing, and I started writing down everything he said, dates, promises, the exact words. She tapped the folder. He told me my house had a lien against it that didn't exist. I had the deed in my lap when he said it. I just smiled and let him keep talking. June had dates. June had the name of a notary who had stamped documents. She was fairly sure the signers had never knowingly signed, and the name of a man at the county recorder's office who had processed a suspicious number of property transfers, all routed through the same small company. Meridian Senior Solutions. Voss's company. The machine had a part that wore, and June Castellano had been quietly writing down its serial number for 2 years. By February, the families were meeting. They met in the back room of a feed store in Sutter's Bend that the owner let them use after Patras asked. A man named Hollis, who had known Raymond Aldrich for 30 years, and who said only when Caleb thanked him that Raymond had once fixed the clock on his grandmother's mantel for nothing. The first meeting was 4 people. The second was 9. By the third, the back room was full, folding chairs borrowed from the church, a coffee urn somebody brought, the windows fogged with the breath of people who had each believed for years that they were the only one. That was the thing that broke them open, watching the others walk in. Each family had carried its shame alone, the private conviction that they should have been there, should have noticed, should have stopped it. And then they sat in a room and saw their own story on a dozen other faces, and the shame began slowly to turn into something else. Not anger, exactly, something steadier than anger. The look of people who have stopped believing they are crazy. Caleb did not run the meetings. He had learned long ago that the man who stands up front becomes the story, and this was not his story. He sat at the back with Juno at his feet and let June Castellano run them, because she had the folder and the spine and the 40 years of reading balance sheets, and because the families trusted one of their own in a way they would never fully trust a stranger in a canvas coat. Still, it was Caleb who kept them moving when they wanted to despair. Caleb who said quietly, each time the room sagged under the weight of how clean the paperwork was, that clean paperwork is just paperwork that has not been read by the right person yet. The right person turned out to be a woman named Sandra Pham, an investigator with the State Attorney General's office who handled elder financial exploitation and who had a stack of complaints against Meridian Senior Solutions sitting in a drawer for lack of anything that rose above one family's word against a smooth man with clean forms. One family's word was easy to dismiss. June Castellano's folder cross-referenced against 11 other families against a notary's stamp that appeared on documents the signers swore they never saw, against a pattern of property transfers that all flowed to the same handful of shell accounts, was not a word. It was a shape. And Sandra Pham, when she finally sat in that fogged-up feed store back room and watched 11 families lay their clean paperwork side by side, recognized the shape. There was a bad stretch in there. There always is. Word got back to Voss, the way word does in small places, that families were meeting, that someone was asking questions, that a folder existed. And Voss did what men like him do when the ground shifts. He did not threaten anyone with violence. He was far too smooth for that. He sent letters, polite, lawyered letters, to each family reminding them of the legally binding agreements their loved ones had signed, warning gently against defamation, against spreading false and damaging claims about a company that had only ever tried to help. The letters were meant to make each family feel alone again, to peel them back off the group one by one with the cold reminder that the paperwork was clean and the law was on his side. For a few days it worked. June called Caleb and said 2 of the families had gotten scared, were talking about backing out, did not want trouble they could not afford. Caleb drove out to see them, both of them, the Foleys, and a man named Petrovsky, whose mother had been moved 4 times in her last year of life. He did not give them a speech. He sat in their kitchens with his dog and he told them the truth, which was that Voss was sending those letters because he was afraid, and that a man only bothers to frighten people he can no longer ignore. The letters were not strength. The letters were the sound a machine makes right before the worn gear gives. They stayed. Everyone stayed. There was an evening in the middle of all of it that Caleb would remember for a long time. The investigation had stalled on a single document, a transfer of Raymond Aldrich's house that Voss's company claimed Raymond had signed in full understanding 3 years back. If that signature held, it would anchor everything else, Voss claimed. The whole pattern would look like a string of unfortunate but legal arrangements. Dana was certain her father had not understood what he signed. His hands, by then, could barely hold a pen. Certainty, though, is not evidence, and the document looked clean. It was Dana who broke it. In the end, and she broke it with a clock. She had kept one of her father's clocks, the only thing of his she still had, a small brass carriage clock he had built the works for himself. She had brought it to a meeting once, just to have a piece of him in the room. And, sitting in the feed store one cold evening, turning it over in her hands, she found what Caleb had been telling them all along was there to be found, the worn part in the smooth machine. Her father engraved his work. Every clock he ever finished, he engraved the date inside the case, the day he completed it, in the same small block letters that were on the back of the metal. It was a habit 40 years deep. And the date Voss claimed Raymond had signed away his house in full understanding was a date Raymond had spent finishing a clock for a neighbor 2 valleys over, a clock that bore that exact date engraved inside its case in her father's own hand. A man who engraved the date on everything he made had been somewhere else on the day his signature supposedly understood what it was signing. It was a small thing. It was the size of a thumbnail. Caleb had learned, though, from a dead man he never met, that the smallest worn gear is the one that stops the whole machine. And when Dana laid that clock on the table next to the transfer document and Sandra Pham saw the 2 dates, the investigation stopped being a stall and started being a case. It did not end in a courtroom showdown. Those endings belong to other kinds of stories. It ended the way these things actually end, slowly, in offices, with subpoenas and forensic accountants, and a notary who, faced with charges of her own, decided she would rather talk than fall alone. Garrett Voss did not stand and face the families he had robbed. Men like him, almost, never do. By the time the Attorney General's office moved, he had already begun trying to dissolve Meridian Senior Solutions and move his accounts, and there was a stretch of weeks where Caleb thought he might slip the net the way he had slipped it before. Vanish into a new town with a new name and a new clipboard and start over on a fresh set of people with nobody left to check on them. He did not slip it. June Castellano's folder, 2 years in the making, had documented enough of the money's path that the forensic accountants could follow it, even as Voss tried to scatter it. And the notary's testimony cracked the clean paperwork open at the seam, and the engraved clock anchored a timeline that 11 other families' accounts then hung from like ornaments. Voss was charged, not with everything he had done, because the law is a blunt instrument, and much of what he had done was the kind of slow cruelty that leaves no fingerprints. With enough, though, enough that the houses began slowly to be clawed back, enough that the money, what could be traced of it, started its long crawl back toward the families it had been taken from. Enough that a man who had spent a decade making himself untouchable spent the spring learning what it felt like to be unable to make the paperwork say whatever he wanted it to say. Dana got the house back. Not the one Voss had taken. That one was gone, sold and resold. The proceeds, though, what the state recovered, came back to her, and it was enough to stop running, enough to stop selling the lamp and the table to make rent, enough to take down the wind chime made of spoons and hang it somewhere it could turn in a warmer wind. She used part of it to do a thing Caleb did not expect. She tracked down one by one the clocks. Her father's clocks, scattered across the valley in estate sales and antique barns and the bottoms of box lots, and she bought them back, all the ones she could find, and she filled a room of the narrow rented house with them, all of them keeping the same time, the way they had in her father's back room. And on a shelf above them she set the Purple Heart, where it belonged, where it had always belonged, in a house that loved the man it was made for. The families stayed together after it was over, which is the part nobody expects, and the part that matters most. They had come into that feed store back room as strangers who shared a shame, and they walked out of it a thing that did not have a name but worked like a family. They checked on each other's parents, they drove each other to appointments. When June Castellano's furnace died in March, 4 trucks were in her driveway by noon, and the thing was fixed by dark, and when she tried to pay, everyone pretended not to hear her. Caleb stood in her driveway that evening, watching the trucks pull away, and understood that this was the real thing the metal had set in motion. Not justice, though justice had come. Something underneath justice. A town full of people who had each believed they were alone, finding out they were not. He had meant to leave. That was the thing about him, the thing the years had made true. He always meant to leave. The truck was fixed by then, the alternator long since replaced, and there was nothing holding him in Harlan Fork or Sutter's Bend or any of it. He had done the thing. The metal was home. The man was charged. He could point the truck at the horizon, the way he always did, and let the country pull him along to the next town, where he would tell himself 3 days and stay 9. He did not leave. He noticed he was not leaving the way you notice a habit you have finally broken, which is to say slowly, and after the fact. There was a morning in early April when the snow had started to give way to mud, and the first hard green was pushing up along the creek, and Caleb was on Hollis's roof at the feed store fixing a leak that had bothered the old man all winter, and Juno was lying in the gravel below, and Dana drove up with a thermos of coffee and her father's carriage clock on the seat beside her, because she had gotten it running again and wanted somebody to see. And Caleb came down off the roof and stood in the mud and drank the coffee and listened to the clock tick. And he realized he had not thought about leaving in 3 weeks. That hit him harder than he expected. He had spent 4 years moving because moving was the only thing that did not ask anything of him. A town you are leaving cannot need you. A person you will not see again cannot be lost. He had buried so many men that he had built his whole life around not being in a place long enough to have something worth burying. And somewhere in the cold months of folding chairs and fogged windows and clean paperwork laid side by side, in the slow work of putting a stranger's metal back where it belonged, he had let a place need him without noticing. And he had started to need it back. Juno had known before he did. She always did. She had stopped watching the road. For 4 years, in every town, the dog had kept one ear turned toward the truck, toward the highway, toward the leaving that always came. Caleb noticed that April morning in the mud, with the coffee going cold in his hands, that she had stopped. She lay in the sun with both ears soft and her eyes half closed and her body easy. Dog at rest in a place she had decided was home. And Caleb understood that she had made the decision for both of them weeks ago and had only been waiting for him to catch up. He took the room over the feed store, the one Hollis had been using for storage. He fixed the things in Sutter's Bend that needed fixing. which turned out to be many things because a town full of old people is a town full of roofs and furnaces and porch steps, and nobody young enough to climb up and see to them. He became, without ever deciding, to the man you called. He was not loud about it. He never told the story of the medal, never took credit for the room full of families or the man who finally answered for what he had done. When people thanked him, he looked away and changed the subject, and Juno would press against the leg of whoever was thanking him, and that was the end of it. June Castellano started a thing she called dryly the Folder Club, which was just the families meeting once a month in the feed store back room. Not to fight anyone anymore, but to keep an eye out, to make sure no smooth man with a clipboard ever again found a single old person in that valley alone enough to be worth robbing. They watched out now. That was the whole machine they had built in the end, out of grief and shame and one forgotten medal. A town that watched out for its own. Raymond Aldrich's clocks all keep the same time in a room in a house that finally got to keep its things. The Purple Heart sits on the shelf above them, the gold cleaned. Now the purple enamel still scratched at the bottom where someone once tried to pry it loose, because Dana left that scratch, said the wear was part of the truth, and she would not polish away what her father had been put through. And on the first Sunday of every month the families gather, and somebody usually brings up the Marine who started it, the quiet man with the dog, and somebody usually points out that he is right there fixing the coffee urn, and would they please stop, and he does not say much, and the dog lies in the sun by the door and the clocks keep time. If you have ever wondered whether one small act matters, whether picking up a single forgotten thing and refusing to set it back down can change anything at all, I want you to carry this with you. A medal sat in a glass case for $18, and a man who had spent his life leaving decided not to walk past it. And because of that, a town that had been quietly robbed of its old people learned to watch out for them, and a daughter got her father back in the only way left to her, and a stranger finally found a place worth staying. You do not have to be a soldier to do this. You only have to refuse to look away from the thing in the glass case. Somewhere near you, right now, someone is being quietly told they are worth $18. Go and tell them they are not. May God keep you, and keep the ones who have no one left to check on them. And may you be, for somebody, the one who would not walk past. If this story moved you, stay close, share it with someone who needs it, and remember that the smallest worn gear is the one that stops the whole machine. Thank you for staying until the end.